Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Rosh Hashanah. We're up to Perek Bet, Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, Neriyahu ben Burcha Yisraelov, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen, and Leavdir ben Chaim Lechaim, for the Refuah Shelema Bacha Bat Esther, and Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betoch Shai Chulei Israel. The Mishnah relates what happened to the witnesses who saw the new moon once they arrived in Yerushalayim. The Mishnah begins, Chatzer Gedola Aita B'Yerushalayim uBet Yazek Aita Nikret. There was a large court in Yerushalayim that was called Bet Yazek. Ulsham Kol Ha'edim Mitkansim uBetin Botkin Otam Sham. And that is where all the witnesses gathered and where the Betin questioned them. Usudot Gedolot Osin Lahem B'Shvil Shur Regilin Lavo. Large feasts were made for them there so that people would be encouraged to come regularly to testify about the new moon. Now, to get to Jerusalem, a witness would often have to go outside his tchum, which is more than 2,000 amot from his place of residence. We know it is forbidden on Shabbat and Yom Tov to go more than 2,000 amot from where one was residing when Shabbat began. This limit is called the tchum Shabbat boundary, or just tchum. If someone leaves his tchum on Shabbat, he must remain where he is for the rest of the day. The Mishnah in Masechet Eruvin, chapter 4, Mishnah 1 says he may go no more than 4 amot in each direction. The Mishnah discusses how this law affected witnesses who came to testify about the new moon on Shabbat. They were allowed to leave their tchum on their way to Yerushalayim because breaking the laws of Shabbat is permitted for the sake of testifying about the new moon, like we spoke about earlier in chapter 1, Mishnah 4. So the Mishnah continues, Barishona lo hayu zazin misham kol hayom. Originally, they would not move from the court of Bet Yazek for the entire day so as not to violate the law of tchum. The entire courtyard of Bet Yazek, being enclosed by walls, was considered the equivalent of each person's 4 amot. Therefore, they could go anywhere within the courtyard, but not outside it. Now, the Mishnah refers to the time after the Greeks had breached the walls of Yerushalayim to the point that the city itself was no longer enclosed. Hitkin Rabban Gamliel Hazaken Shu Me'alchin Alpayim Amal L'chol Ruach. However, Rabban Gamliel the elder decreed that they should be considered like people who were in the courtyard of Bet Yazek when Shabbat began, and therefore they may go 2,000 amot in the city of Yerushalayim in every direction. Rabban Gamliel made this enactment so that the witnesses would not be discouraged from coming again in the future. Since the tchum prohibition is merely a rabbinic law, Rabban Gamliel and his court were authorized to override it for this purpose. Rabban Gamliel's enactment was not limited to new moon witnesses. And this law applies not only to these witnesses who go outside the tchum to testify about the new moon, but also to a midwife who goes outside her tchum to deliver a baby. And to one who goes outside his tchum to save people from a fire, from an attacking army, from a flooding river, from a collapsed building. They too are considered like the residents of the town to which they came and have permission to go 2,000 amot from the town in every direction. Since a midwife and rescuer are allowed and even obligated to desecrate Shabbat by leaving their tchum or even doing melacha for the sake of saving life, they are granted the right to go anywhere in the town and 2,000 amot beyond it, even for purposes unrelated to saving life. And that is in a Mishnah Hey. Mishnah Vav continues, Kitzad botkin et ha'edim. How do the judges examine the witnesses? Zug sheba rishon botkin oto rishon. The pair of witnesses that arrives first is examined first. The judges bring in the older one of the witnesses, separating him from his partner, and say to him, now the witnesses are questioned separately, as in all cases of testimony, to prevent one from copying the answers of the other. The older witness is privileged to testify first out of respect for his age. The Mishnah says they say to the older witness, Emo ketzad reita televana, tell us how you saw the new moon. Lifnei chama ulacha chama, was the unlit part of the moon toward the sun or away from the sun? Now, since the moon reflects the light of the sun, the lit part of the moon, the crescent, is always nearer the sun, and the unlit part is always farther from the sun. This is in diagram A, and the arts to elucidated. Therefore, if the witness says that the unlit part was nearer the sun, which would be diagram B, the judges know that he is lying or mistaken, as the Mishnah states below. Litzfona lidroma, was the moon on the northern side of the sky or the southern side of the sky? Close to sunset, the new moon always appears above the western horizon, but it may be either on the southern side of the sky or the northern side, which would be diagram C and D. On the basis of astronomical calculations, the court knew on which side it should appear at the time of the year. If the witness statement does not match the court's calculation, his testimony is rejected. Kama haya gavoa, how high was the new moon from the horizon? The witness is asked how high the moon appeared above the horizon. For example, whether it seemed as high as a building at a certain distance from the witness, or 2 stories, or 3 stories, as the Rambam explains in Hilchot Kiddush HaChodesh, chapter 2, Halachot 4 and 5. Ul'ain hayanoteh, which way was the lit crescent of the moon pointing, to the north or the south? The Beddin asks whether the horns, the tips of the crescent, were pointing north or south. When the new moon appears to the left of the sun, its horns point south. That would be diagram E. And when it appears to the right of the sun, its horns point north. That would be diagram F. The Chama Yarachav, how wide was the crescent? Now the witness is asked to estimate the width of the crescent, which is very narrow at the beginning of the month and gets wider as the month progresses. For example, they ask him whether the crescent appeared as wide as a barley corn held a certain distance away, or 2 barley corns. Im amar lifnei chama lo amar klum. If the witness said that the moon's unlit part was turned toward the sun, he has said nothing, meaning his answer is false and his testimony is rejected. In fact, if he answered any of the questions incorrectly, his testimony is invalid. The Mishnah specifies this answer, that the unlit part of the moon faced the sun, because that is always wrong, whereas the correct answers to the other questions depend on the time of the year and other calculations. After they examine the first witness, they bring in the second witness and examine him, asking him the same questions that they asked the first. If their words are consistent, there are no serious contradictions between the 2 witnesses, their testimony is valid. The judges then ask all the other pairs of witnesses about the main points of their testimony without going into detail. This is done not because they are needed for the testimony of the first pair of witnesses that has already. This is not needed because the testimony of the first pair of witnesses has already been accepted, but only so that they will not leave disheartened that they did not testify before the judges. To prevent them from feeling that their journey has been wasted, the witnesses are asked to give some testimony so that they will be encouraged to come regularly to testify about the new moon in the future. And that is in Abotav today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.